Thank you for joining us for the first part in a two-part series, the Educator Workshop, Start, Stop, or Continue. We are delighted, I'm delighted to be joined here by two of the exhibition co-curators for Unfinished Thoughts Left Visible, who will walk us through the big ideas of the exhibition. I will just give you a brief breakdown of how we'll divide our time tonight. We'll spend about 20 minutes with each of the exhibition co-curators. We'll have a question and answer session at the end. We'll take about 10 minutes. And then I'll spend some time sharing a bit about resources you can use to follow up to learn more about the exhibition or bring the exhibition into your classroom, as well as next steps about part 2 of the program. And we'll take just a moment to introduce ourselves. Great. My name is Claire Moore. I am a museum educator at the Met and specifically focus on teacher programs. And we'll pan over to our exhibition curators here.
Hi, I'm Andrea Bayer. I'm the Jane Wrightsman curator in the Department of European Paintings.
Hello, my name is Kelly Baum, and I'm the curator of post-war and contemporary art at the Met.
Fantastic. So we will dive right in. As you can see, we are screening live from my office, so very much behind the scenes. So we'll go ahead and I'll return to the slides and we can get going here. And Andrea will take the lead on the first part of the exhibition and giving us a context.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're well. I'm really delighted to be speaking to educators today, and Kelly and I will talk to you about an exhibition that is currently on at the Met Breuer. It's the inaugural exhibition there. You can see a wonderful shot of the building on your slide. It's an exhibition that goes across a very large chronological and geographical period, beginning in the Renaissance. Our earliest work of art is from 1437, and it goes up to a work that was just completed right before the opening of the exhibition. Let me say a couple of words before we dive into the walking through the exhibition itself. I wanted to say that this exhibition came about because our director, Tom Campbell, challenged us to think about, conceive, and develop exhibitions that would be a little bit out of the box, the normal traditional metropolitan exhibitions, and think about large issues of artistic practice that went across geographies and chronology. And we began work with another curator named Nicholas Cullinan, who's gone on to become the director of the National Portrait Gallery in London. And he had this idea that we should look at unfinished works of art for what they told us about their making, the idea of the artistic practice behind them. And he began to gather works of art. He came at it from the modern and contemporary side, and I was always interested in the earlier historical periods. So I'm going to bring up a fantastic work of art, which you'll see on the 3rd floor of the Breuer building. The exhibition begins on the 3rd floor. In order to give you a little introduction about the two main threads, the two main strands of the exhibition, how they come together. And then you'll see that when Kelly talks about the 20th century, that she begins with those two strands as a premise, and then talks about how in the post-war period, after World War II, new conceptions came into play, and the concept of unfinished became even more interesting in a way. So our original strands of thought have to do with works that were left unintentionally unfinished, incomplete. That is, something interrupted them. The artist died, the sitter died, the sitter moved away, a commission fell through. Often we don't really know the reason, but something brought the work of art to a halt before anyone could have considered it complete. And, why are we interested in those works of art? Well, as early as Pliny, and we'll see, I'll speak a little bit more about this in a minute. As early as the Roman author Pliny, people recognized that works of art that were unfinished had left traces of their making on them, and that they give us access to what the artist was thinking and how the artist was working. So that's one side. The other side is actually represented by this great work by Rembrandt that you see on the screen. And that is more a question of unfinishedness. And if we could have gotten around the limitations of the English language, maybe we would have even used that word as the title of our exhibition, unfinishedness, that a work has something in it that makes it feel unfinished. And I'm going to tell you an anecdote about Rembrandt that will bring this to life. So about late in Rembrandt's career, about the time that this was painted, around 1657, somebody asked Rembrandt, why do you leave so many of your works seemingly unfinished or half finished? And the artist is said to have replied, work of art is complete when in it my intentions have been realized. And this is a very important and groundbreaking kind of statement, in which the artist declares that he or she has the latitude to call a work complete, even if to contemporaries it didn't match their expected norms of finish. So the St. Bartholomew is a great example of this. It shows the apostle seated, looking out with this very strong glance, and he's holding a knife, which actually is the implement of his own torture and death. And in fact, the great historian Simon Schama wrote that this is absolutely amazing, the way this man holds in this everyday manner what is the instrument of torture in his own life. So here's my question when I stand in front of this work of art. What were the artist's intentions? What is he trying to show us here? And I think you can see that his intentions drew him to this extraordinary face and to trying to bring alive the personality of this apostle, who in the medieval literature we're told had a dark beard and dark hair and a fierce glance. That personality is captured in the head, then in this amazing hand and knife. Again, the artist brings our view there, brings our eye there, and in just a couple of brush strokes, each one of which has to play its role in the depiction, he lets us know about the end of this figure's life. What he's not interested in a way, is all the rest. We don't see the figure's left arm. We don't know what kind of room he's sitting in. We don't know what kind of chair he's sitting in. All of that is left basically ill-defined or undefined. So here Rembrandt stops well before any of his contemporaries would have expected him to stop. So those are the two main traces of the works on the third floor of the exhibition. The unintentionally incomplete that gives us such access to the artist's mind, and the intentionally work of intentional unfinishedness. As we go through, we begin, in a chronological fashion. So we begin with the Renaissance and the Baroque. And in fact, I want you to take a look at the work on the left-hand side of the screen. That is a literally incomplete work by the great Raphael follower, Perino del Vaga. And when you get up close to it, and I just looked at this with some students actually, they really got into looking at this one. You see the preparation of the panel, you see all of the underdrawing, you see how he has begun to paint up the two children and then has stopped. And I have a theory about why that might be so, but we don't know for sure. But it is a painting that nonetheless in 1525, when Perino stopped painting it, was not discarded, but was kept, was treasured, was prized by a whole group of collectors, moving forward to today. It now sits in the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And directly after that, I wanted to show you, in fact, the quotation from Pliny the Elder, which tells us why even as early as 79 AD, people were so beguiled, that's the word that Pliny uses, by these unfinished works of art, because in them are seen the preliminary drawings left visible and the artist's actual thoughts. And then Pliny casts this in a way that brings out both the positive and the negative about this, because to him, he was looking at works of art that were interrupted by death. And so you also have this sense of disquiet that you will never know what this work would have looked like finished. We will never see it finished. So it's both the beauty of its beginning and the sadness of its lack of being able brought to completion. Now I'm going to pick up the pace here because we have the exhibition is very large, and I just wanted to bring your attention to a number of the absolute masterpieces in the show. The earliest work in the show is Jan van Eyck's St. Barbara, 1437. It looks at first glance like an elaborate drawing done in brush and ink and metal point, but in fact, the beautiful blue of the top of the sky, and when you get close up to it, you can see there's white tracery in the architecture. That paint is all put there by the artist himself. We're quite sure about that. And it's not a drawing on paper, it's on panel. And it's in its original frame, which has been painted and signed and dated by the artist. So, you know, what the heck was he trying to do? Did he begin something that he thought of as a painting and then get to this point and said, I'm not going to cover up this drawing. I'm going to leave this as a sort of experimental work in which I'm halfway between drawing and painting? Or is it in fact an unfinished painting? The painting on the right, the monumental work by Titian of the Flaying of Marsyas, is one of our signature pieces in the exhibition. It comes from Archbishop's Palace in the Czech Republic. I doubt that very many Americans have ever seen it. It has traveled once or twice, but very, very rarely. And in it, Titian tells this amazing, tragic story of the satyr Marsyas. We see him at the very center, upside down, who has the temerity to challenge Apollo, the god, to a musical contest, a contest he cannot win. The Marsyas cannot win. And his awful punishment is one of flaying. And what Titian has done here is to use the power of his brush to tell this tragic story in an entirely new way, in which some of the figures or parts of the figures are brought up to the high finish anyone would have expected, such as the figure to the right who wears a bright gold crown. But then a lot of other parts of the picture are left only semi-completed, filled with the energy of his brush and the power of his skill, but absolutely not at a level of finish that his contemporaries would have expected. And I'll just add one more anecdote about this painting. Not specifically this painting, but about Titian's late style, that a more conventional artist came to his studio once and looked at one of these late paintings and said to himself, he records this, I looked at it and I saw nothing but spots, macchie in Italian. And I was absolutely perplexed. But then I stood back from the painting and it began to come together in my eye and my mind. And I realized that I was seeing, and then he describes that painting, which included a road with trees and foliage and the rising sun and so on. In other words, it required the viewer's own imagination and eye to bring the painting together. And once that happened, and the viewer is in a way invested in the painting, has made sense of it for himself. And this is the great tradition in European painting and sculpture that goes forward with the Italian name non finito, which in Italian means not finished, but which accrued meanings over the years to mean this intentionally unresolved, open approach to painting that can be used in an extremely powerful manner. Two other great works in this Renaissance section are Donatello's Lamentation over the Dead Christ from London, in which you get the same kind of yin and yang, or back and forth between the highly finished and the absolutely rough and unfinished, completely new in Renaissance sculpture here. Or Leonardo's magical Head of a Woman from Parma, in which he has carefully painted her face, her eyes, her nose, and so on, and then this wonderful hair that goes out, just hinted at, just sketched out to the sides, something that has given the work its current nickname, La Scapigliata, the woman with disheveled hair. Here's a great shot of us installing our own El Greco Vision of St. John. About 37% of the exhibition is made up of Met works from European paintings, European sculpture and decorative arts, drawings and prints, and modern and contemporary, and the American wing. So it's really starts out as a Met-based show. And here, the thing I love about this photograph is that we've brought the painting, which normally hangs in our European paintings galleries, high up on the wall. We've brought it into the Breuer, where it is now enframed by the architecture itself, by the strong grid of the ceiling and of the floor. It makes it look like an incredibly modern painting. What it actually is an incomplete, unfinished altarpiece by El Greco, left in his studio at his death, but it is extremely important to the history of modern art, because in 1905 it was in Paris. Picasso saw it then. It was at the back of his mind when he was painting the Demoiselle d'Avignon at MoMA, and then it was studied as well by Jackson Pollock, by Thomas Hart Benton, and others. We leave the strictly chronological to go to a section on the genre of portraiture, which goes across time, beginning with the Renaissance all the way down. You can see we go from a Baroque painting to an 18th century painting to a Klimt, and there you catch a glimpse in the end of a Lucian Freud. In portraiture, we have an extraordinary number of works of art that are either incomplete or seemingly incomplete, that have, as I say, have come down to us. And we wanted to examine this question in a good deal of detail. We have put forward the hypothesis that in many of these paintings, what we see, like in the Rembrandt, I would say, is where the artist needed to have his or her focus, and in turn, where we need to have our focus. Oops. Okay. So here are three examples from the 18th century. I'll start with the one in the middle, actually, which is George Romney's own self-portrait. Each of these pictures has its own story. It's quite remarkable. So George Romney was painting this picture for a friend. They were at another friend's home, and he got this much done, and then he took it back to his studio. His friend, for whom it was painted, said, you know, I'm ready to take it. And George Romney apparently said, it's not finished, it's not finished. But eventually the guy took it. And even then, Romney's son said, you know, what a shame, he took this painting, it wasn't finished. And from what we can understand, the recipient felt that it was finished for him, that it had everything in it that it needed, and that it didn't need to be painted out to the edges of the canvas. It absolutely captured the sitter's presence and personality. On the left, we have one of the paintings which brings out a political statement. This is a marvelous work, which is Benjamin West's group portrait of all of the people who were signing the preliminary treaty between Britain and America in 1782. So there you've got all the Americans. You can recognize Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, so on. They all sat for him. And then the British people wouldn't show up. They couldn't get them to sit. Why? We're not 100% sure, but we sort of believe it was because that they were uncomfortable being there and didn't want to be really part of this group. West brought it back to his studio in the United States, and John Quincy Adams visited him and wrote in his diary, "This is such an important picture, it must be finished, it should go to Congress." West could never get the British people to sit for him, and the work was never finished. It's a piece of American history, that. And finally, the beautiful Thomas Lawrence, which has, you immediately see two portraits of the same woman, and in fact, to the far left, there's a graphite sketch of the same woman's head. At the upper left, Lawrence wrote, "Painted by Thomas Lawrence in a fit of folly." He was deeply infatuated with this young woman. He met her at a house party in England. He too brought this picture in this state back to his studio, intending to finish it, and he never did. After his death, the sitter came forward and said, "You know, I paid him for that work." She never got it. Eventually, it did come down to her descendants. Why didn't he finish it? Oh, sorry. Okay, another two great portraits. One by Gustav Klimt of Ria Munch. This is a posthumous portrait. The young woman had actually committed suicide. Her parents had requested this portrait to be done, so he was using a photograph. And then so much of mortality and interrupted lives appear in this exhibition. Not only had she died, but the artist actually died while he was working on this painting. It never left his studio. We see the beautiful charcoal sketch of her drapery. We see that he's painted in her face, which has a rather ghostly aspect to it, with this powdered look and the high flush of the cheeks. And then he has begun this incredible ornament of the flowers around her. But as you get towards the bottom of the picture, it just disappears. An interrupted life, an interrupted work. Ditto for the Alice Neel, which is our true signature image for the exhibition. You'll see it on all of the posters. Alice Neel working on portraits in New York in the 1950s, 1960s, inviting people to come to her studio. She met James Hunter. She was very interested in people's lives. She did a first sitting with him. She knew that he had been drafted and was about to go to the Vietnam War. He never came back to the second sitting. She was left with this unfinished work of art. 10 years later, she decided it had to be considered complete. She signed the back. She exhibited it at the Whitney in the same building in 1974. We've done a little bit of research on trying to track down James Hunter. As far as we know, he didn't die in the war in Vietnam. He's not on the war memorial. On the contrary, he was discharged from the army in 1967. And we are hoping that over the course of this exhibition, he may come forward. Do it again. Okay. The long 19th century. This part of the installation on the third floor ends with a pretty breathtaking run of 19th century pictures. You see a great Degas on the right-hand side of your screen, a work that Degas began in the 1860s, worked on again in the 1880s, worked on again in the 1890s, and then finally, close to his death, when somebody actually was quite interested in buying it, he wrote, "No, this picture is going to be with me until my death. After my death, somebody can buy it, even though it is unfinished." So this is a work, this is again one of these paintings, an incredible example of the unending process for some artists of their great paintings and how they try to bring them to completion, but cannot always do so. Two paintings I just want to bring to your attention from the 19th century section. Edward Manet's The Funeral. This is another Met picture. I've never seen it. I've never looked at it in quite the same way here. It is a painting that represents Baudelaire's funeral. Baudelaire was a great friend of Manet's. He gets it to this point, you get the sense that it's taking place under these thundery Parisian skies, casting these shadows across the buildings of the city, but he never finishes it. And it remains in Manet's studio, a testament to this friendship, until Manet's death. Several years after Manet's death, it's purchased by Pissarro, the great artist, who writes excitedly to his son that he's managed to get this work by Manet. And another underlying theme of this exhibition is how interested artists are in other artists' unfinished works, that they too feel this pull of the artistic process that's being made visible. And with the Claude Monet, I just want to remind you of that people said about the first Impressionist paintings in the Impressionist exhibition of 1873-74, the same things that people had been saying about Titian. That is, that if you got too close, they looked like spots. But that if you backed up and allowed your mind and imagination to take over, they came together into organized images. And so the interesting thing is that these works are called non fini, exactly the same way that Italian works are called non finito. And this is a true continuation of an artistic heritage. And finally, I'm going to end with two great landscapes. We have a room devoted to the works by Turner that he left to the nation at his death in 1851. They, like so many of the other works in this exhibition, are caught in some kind of space in which we're not sure how close they were to the artist's intention in the sense of being finished, or whether they were really left in a very unfinished state. And this is important to us because these works by Turner, these late works by Turner, have entered our bloodstream. To us, they represent, I would say, the high point of Turner's work. And yet we have no idea whether he would have been content with having them exhibited in this state. Their abstraction, their complete lack of any figuration of ships, of birds, of houses. You can usually only sense the land, the sea, and the sky. And Frederick Kensett's beautiful landscape, also left in his studio at his death, considered one of his last paintings, again, without anything that normally appears in Kensett's work of figuration, of marking the distances with boats, with people, with birds. You can see how this really does bring us to the very edge of abstraction.
As we transition, I just wanted to remind folks who tuned in a little bit later that if you have any questions, we would love to hear them. You can add them using the question and answer app, and we will be transitioning to Kelly Baum, a curator from our modern and contemporary art.
Hello, everyone. It's interesting, a little awkward to talk to you without seeing you, but I hope that you're getting a lot so far out of our presentation on Unfinished. And I am going to walk you through the works of art that you find on the 4th floor. And this is a floor that concludes the exhibition Unfinished Thoughts Left Visible. When you initially step off of the elevator on the 4th floor, you see a suite of paintings by Picasso and Cezanne, as well as a large monumental work, you see it on the left, by Luc Tuymans. The Cezannes and Picassos are from the 20th century. Early 20th century mostly. The Tuymans was painted in the wake of 9/11. Now the works by Cezanne and Picasso, you see a different suite here. These works represent both an end and a beginning. An end in the sense that they summarize and encapsulate an approach to the unfinished that is very much at play on the 3rd floor. They represent the culmination of an aesthetic, an unfinished aesthetic, which was embraced and promulgated by Titian, by Rembrandt, by Monet. they represent a beginning in the sense that they forecast an entirely different, more conceptual approach to the unfinished, one that we explore in greater detail in works made after 1950. What you're seeing on the left is a monumental work by Picasso called The Charnel House, painted at the tail end of the Second World War. Picasso described this painting as an image of a massacre, and we can imagine the myriad massacres that he would have had on his mind during these months. It's possible that he saw some of the earliest photographs, published photographs of the concentration camps. It's also possible that he was inspired in his depiction of a massacre, inspired by a documentary about the assassination of a Spanish Republican under Franco's regime in Spain. Now, this is a work that has been signed and dated. It was also sold during the artist's lifetime, all of which suggests that he considered it finished. And yet, it's very clearly incomplete. There are very obvious signs that Picasso had more work to do, more work in front of him. And yet he chose to conclude, he chose to step away from the canvas much earlier than we might have thought. We see sections of the canvas that remain unpainted or underpainted. When you're standing close to the canvas, you see the underdrawing, and you see some of the edits and changes that he made midway through the process. When I stand in front of a painting like this, I ask myself if Picasso's representation of an act of extreme emotional, psychological, and physical distress, I ask myself if his representation of a massacre would have been more or less powerful if he had painted it in a photorealistic manner. If this work looked like a photograph, if it was recognizable as something in the real world, would we be as moved by it? Would we be as horrified by it as we are? And opinions will differ. I tend to think not. I actually think that it's precisely because the work is unfinished, or in this case, seemingly unfinished, that it draws us in. It forces us to fill in the blanks, to complete the picture for the artist. It forces us into a state of extreme intimacy with the scene. And like Titian, like Rembrandt, we find yet another artist who is using the unfinished aesthetic to very specific ends, ones that involve kind of pricking the conscience and morality of viewers. Two more paintings by Picasso, a portrait on the left of one of his wives, Olga, and a portrait by Picasso and a portrait of by Cézanne. On the left, a portrait of Picasso's wife, Olga. On the right, a portrait of Cézanne's wife. Picasso was greatly influenced by Cézanne's paintings, like nearly every artist who came of age after Cézanne. Artists studied his finished paintings. They also studied his unfinished paintings. Cézanne's that is, and some of Cézanne's unfinished paintings were shown in a memorial exhibition in 1907. Braque, a great friend and colleague of Picasso's, purchased one such painting from the exhibition. Now, what you see on the screen is, at this point, is a quote by the artist Robert Morris. Robert Morris came of age in the early 1960s. He was of a very different generation than either Cézanne or Picasso. And I've decided to display this quote here because it summarizes an approach to the unfinished, which is characteristic of the decades after the Second World War. And he says, here at the very top, under attack is the rationalistic notion that art is a form of work that results in a finished product. So what's interesting to me about this statement, and this statement was meant to represent not only Morris's work, but the work of some of the artists you see on this slide, Yayoi Kusama, Jackson Pollock, Saul LeWitt. What's interesting about this statement, made in 1969, is that Robert Morris, not unlike Titian or Rembrandt or Monet, that Robert Morris and many of his contemporaries were rebelling against the idea that their job was to make works of art that were static, singular, permanent, fixed, or finished. They rebelled against finish and finishedness, and they embraced the unfinished. Now, our task in these latter sections of the exhibition was to understand how unfinishedness is expressed in art after the war. This forced us to confront the relationship between the unfinished and abstraction, between unfinishedness and sculpture, between unfinishedness and video. The works in this section of the show are quite different, dramatically different in some cases than what appears on the third floor, even in the section on Cézanne and Picasso. And yet, these are the very artists who did the most to expand our definition of what counted as a finished work of art. There are several subsections to this exhibition, and each section is devoted to a theme that relates to the unfinished, that expands our understanding of the unfinished. And these themes are ones that were discussed and debated by artists themselves. On the left, you see two paintings by the Polish artist Roman Opałka, two details from a larger project that he commenced in 1965. In this project, Opałka set himself the task of counting to infinity on canvases. Both of these canvases consist of a series of sequential numbers. Opałka knew when he set out that there was no way to complete this task. There's no way to count to infinity. And in fact, the only way that this task would ever be finished, and perfectly so, would be upon his death. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. The very last detail from the series is only half painted. It's not unfortunately featured in our exhibition. Infinity, though, became a very important theme around which we selected other works. Works that continue indefinitely in time or space, works of art that seem bigger or larger or more expansive than they actually are. These works of art pressure our definition of finish. Works of art that embrace the infinite can, by definition, not be finished. We've now entered a different section of the exhibition, one devoted to your role, the role of the viewer in the work of art. Against the back wall, you see a painting by Andy Warhol from the early 1960s, do-it-yourself still life. This work of art is a finished painting that depicts an unfinished paint by numbers kit. It reminds me very much of the Alice Neel painting downstairs, insofar as it is a finished painting that is incomplete, or rather an incomplete painting that is finished. What interested me about this, what continues to interest me about this painting is the way it addresses the viewer, what this painting seems to ask of you. Warhol's painting, because it's incomplete, it seems to invite you to pick up a pen or a brush and fill in the blanks. It seems to invite you to finish what the artist has only begun. Now, this work, and here is a close-up of the Warhol and another painting by Carrie James Marshall from 2009. And unfortunately, we don't have an image of the works I wanted to discuss, except on the very back wall on the right. But this Andy Warhol, insofar as it seems to suggest you to pick up a brush and finish the painting for him, relates to a range of sculptures that were created in the 1960s by artists in the United States and Europe and Latin America. And these are works of art that were meant to be changed, altered by you, the viewer. You see one such object in the very back in the center, a small cabinet by the American artist George Brecht. It consists of a series of drawers and doors and shelves that contain a range of ordinary everyday objects. It was made in 1961. When it was first displayed, you, the viewer, were intended to pick these objects up, to change their location, to swap them out, to play with them, to perform them. And because we were intended to participate in this work, because we were intended to change it, the work of art essentially can never be finished. It's always in the process of becoming something different than it was before. Now we've entered the next to last section of the exhibition devoted to the subject of entropy. Entropy is a scientific word. It's the scientific term for energy drain. And all systems, man-made or natural, are prone to energy drain. And entropy is a fancy word essentially for death or decay or deterioration. What you find in the 1960s is a great number of artists, some of the most experimental artists, in building decay into their works of art. They begin to make sculptures with materials that are the result of erosion, like the Robert Smithson that you see in front of you. They also begin to make works of art that are intended to decay over time. This is true of the two sculptures on the left by Janine Antoni, made over the course of 1993, 1994. On the far left, you see a self-portrait of the artist rendered in chocolate. On the left, you see a self-portrait of the artist rendered in soap. Now, chocolate and soap are inherently unstable materials. These sculptures, as a result, will decay over time. They are in a process of slowly dying. Now, because the lifespan of these objects is finite, because they are essentially impermanent, they can never truly be finished. They're unfinishable. In fact, they're in the process of being unfinished before our eyes. Now, it wasn't only that suggested them for inclusion in the show. We were also fascinated by what Janine did to the sculptures after making them. Now, the bust in chocolate, Janine systematically licked with her own tongue. And when you're close to the sculpture, you see the traces of that activity on the right side of her face. The version in soap, she bathed with in a tub with water. And the action of bathing, the interaction of soap and water resulted in the erosion of her features. Essentially, Janine made these works by partially destroying them. She finished them by unmaking them. On the right is a not so different sculpture by the artist Urs Fischer. It's a bronze version of an original made of clay. After finishing the sculpture, after rendering a otherwise perfect depiction of a female nude lounging on a sofa, the artist clawed at the clay. He removed sections of the figure. He removed sections of the chair. And while that clay was still wet, he cast all of it in bronze. We are now in the second to last section of the show. You're looking at a picture of what we call our sculpture island. The unfinished sculptures of Michelangelo proved inspirational to generations of artists. And you might know that not unlike Leonardo, Michelangelo had trouble finishing work. He had trouble bringing his paintings and sculptures to a state of completion. And when he died, he left behind dozens and dozens of unfinished works of art, sculptures included. These sculptures were preserved and were actually installed in public spaces where they are accessible to artists centuries later, including Rodin and Moderno Rosso and Louise Bourgeois. You see works by all three of those artists in front of you on the sculpture island. But unlike Michelangelo, these sculptors created works of art that were only seemingly unfinished, whereas Michelangelo unintentionally left behind areas of roughly chiseled, unrendered stone. Rodin, Bourgeois, and Rosso deliberately included raw material, evidence of raw material in their finished works. And here you see some details. Rodin's The Hand of God. This, I think, is an especially brilliant use of the unfinished aesthetic. Here, unfinishedness operates both at the level of material and technique, but it also operates allegorically. This is a representation, essentially, of creation, both spiritual, biological, and artistic. We see a depiction of the hand of God emerging from, again, an unfinished block of stone. Cradled in that hand are the figures of Adam and Eve, the entwined figures of Adam and Eve, who emerge from, again, a roughly chiseled block of stone. Here we can imagine Rodin comparing himself to God. Both the artist, both the sculptor and God, make something from nothing. They turn raw material into life, or art, as the case may be. There are a range of sculptures and paintings from the mid to late 20th century as well. In the background of this slide, you see two unfinished, literally unfinished paintings by Mondrian. On the fourth floor of the exhibition, we display primarily finished paintings and sculptures. And it's something to keep in mind that in this exhibition of 200 works of art, only 45 are truly unfinished. Only 45 works of art were left unfinished in the artist's studio at the time of their death. Our primary subject is, in fact, finished paintings and sculptures that embrace the unfinished in more conceptual or aesthetic ways. From these two Mondrians, though, which again are literally unfinished, you learn a great deal about the artist's technique. We tend to think of Mondrians, given their perfection, both spiritual and artistic, as springing fully formed from the artist's head. We think of Mondrian as somebody who had the ability to translate an idea from head to canvas instantaneously. But in fact, he labored just as hard and just as long as other artists. In the Mondrian, on the right, we see him using tape, and in here, Mondrian would experiment and adjust his compositions using pieces of tape. In the last gallery, we see a range of paintings from the 1950s up to the present day. The great Willem de Kooning, Woman 1, made over the course of 1950 to 52, a painting that bears a striking resemblance, in fact, to the Titian, given its degree of expressiveness and given its embrace of all things open-ended, unresolved, and seemingly unfinished. These paintings are accompanied by a slideshow by the contemporary artist Robert Gober, Slides of a Changing Painting from 1982-83. And in this slideshow, you see changes that the artist made to a single painting over the course of the year. The painting changes before our eyes. It morphs from one thing to another. It is repeatedly finished and then unfinished, finished and unfinished again. It's a painting that's always in process. It's a painting that flaunts the act of its own making. We conclude on the fourth floor. In fact, we conclude the exhibition as a whole with 6 paintings by the American artist Cy Twombly. These are paintings that were made around 1986. They've never before been seen outside of the artist's studio. Our colleague Sheena Wagstaff, chair of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Art, believes that these paintings are finished. Archival research suggests that the reason the artist never let them go, the reason he was never comfortable showing them, is that he was unable to finalize the sequence. He considered these 6 paintings a single work of art, not 6 individual paintings, not 6 paintings from a series, but rather a single work of art. And if you're dealing with a single work of art made of parts, the order becomes of particular importance. He really agonized over the decision. He agonized over the sequence. He was never able to solve the problem, and so he never exhibited them. And they're here thanks to the generosity of the estate of Cy Twombly. And that concludes my own introduction to the exhibition.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kelly. I wanted to be sure that folks knew next steps. If you're really excited about the exhibition and want to learn more, there is a wonderful website for the exhibition where you can find an overview, you can find entries for the objects in the exhibition, you can listen to audio guides, stops, as well as find information about how to access the catalog. And I will share a bit about the upcoming on-site program here at the museum as another possible next step for those people who are in New York City or close enough to get here for that date. But I just wanted to remind you before I go on to that point, if you have any questions for Kelly or Andrea, feel free to use the question and answer button to add those, and we will respond to those at the end. So just a preview of the upcoming on-site teaching practicum, part 2 of this program. We will be investigating on-site at the museum on April 16th during a full-day program where student learning can be enhanced through experiences with unfinished art or works that appear to be. And we are really excited to have contemporary artist Arlene Sheckett on board for the day, who will share a bit about her process as an artist and how she grapples with those questions. If you want to learn more about that program or register, there's the URL there, and I'll also send a follow-up email with the hyperlink for those people who registered online. So we will turn to, let's take a look and see. So far we don't have any questions. We'll give you just a moment to think. You're probably overwhelmed. That was a lot of information. So we'll give you a few moments, but is there any closing remarks, Andrea or Kelly, that you'd like to share before we sign off?
I just want to say that we've walked around this exhibition, and now I've been around with some high school students and college-age students as well, and students are very excited about this exhibition. It's an opportunity for them to think very broadly about artistic problems, artistic practice, and to see many, many different kinds of outcomes in so many different media and across such a broad period of time. I initially was a little bit nervous about presenting this to students because it's very conceptual, and I was wondering whether there were going to be ways for them to get into the material. But I've found that that's not a problem at all, that they react very viscerally to the works themselves. They get it right away, and I think that this is a fantastic exhibition to teach about and to teach from.
And just to follow up on Andrea's comment, and I agree completely. I think that if we were to summarize this exhibition's big theme, its big theme is really creativity. It's the creative process, and we are all creative people, but we express our creativity in different ways, in music, in dance, and in writing, and of course also in the visual arts. And we've discovered that that creative people of many different stripes identify with the exhibition and learn from it, because the act of creating, the labor and agony of creating, all of which are on display in these exhibitions, this is an experience that's universal and can be generalized to include the act of finishing a story or a musical composition or a dance. And so there are many lessons to be drawn from this exhibition that go beyond the art historical narrative we construct.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for your time this afternoon and planning, and I look forward to seeing those of you who are able to make it on April 16th. If you are really excited about the program and wanted to share with it, the recording will be available on the event page after, so if you wanted to pass it on to a colleague, that'd be great. And it looks like just in the nick of time, we got a question. So the question is, I can't recall if you already spoke about this, but is there any record of Impressionist artists actually viewing the Titian painting and being influenced by it?
Probably not, because that Titian painting from the late 17th century was in an archbishop's palace in the town of Kroměříž in what is now the Czech Republic. So it was quite out of the way for Parisian artists. But they certainly were very aware of other works by Titian, both at the Louvre, and if they traveled to Madrid, as we know many of them did, then they would have seen the great works, late works by Titian that would have arrived to the court of Philip II. And so, yes, indeed, they were quite well aware of Titian's late work.
Great, thank you for that question, Kathy. And Mary Ann Gaynor chimes in. She wants to know what pieces fascinate each of you the most.
That's such a hard, that's a hard question. I think I'm fascinated in a more visceral way by actually some of the works that appear on the third floor. And so I think my intellectual proximity to the post-war material, it almost precludes fascination in that way. But I feel like I know them too well. But there are so many paintings from on the third floor that fascinate me. Actually, and the one I'll mention is ironically from 1965. It's the Alice Neal painting, which whose story I think is so powerful, and which summarizes, you know, so much of the artistic conversation about what can and can't be a finished painting.
And I would say that the room I keep getting drawn back to is the room of paintings by Turner. We have 5 unbelievable works from Turner's bequest to the nation. I find them very, very beautiful to begin with, and to see all 5 of them together in a small, rather contemplative setting, I find almost overwhelming. And I'm very drawn to these works that are deeply representative of what an artist was trying to do late in life, but that we still don't know whether how far along he had come with them. I like that and that ambiguity about them, and I find them very, very powerful.
And I would add there are 2 that we didn't, I don't believe we showed during our survey of the exhibition. Two paintings by the French artist Jacques-Louis David from the very late 18th century, an unfinished portrait, actually two unfinished portraits. And unfinished portraits whose creation was interrupted by the French Revolution, and I find those to be just incredible historical documents and terrific paintings.
Wonderful. Well, we are right on time. I want to thank everybody for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.